All right, good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this evening's inaugural lecture by Professor Derek McGhee. It is a pleasure to see so many people here, a wide background, and a particular warm welcome to Derek's family. It's always a pleasure to have family members here on such occasions. Derek is our professor of sociology, but he's also our faculty dean for research in humanities and social sciences, and indeed director of our Institute for Social Inclusion. Derek actually started his academic career as probably one of the first professors in a Russell group who actually started their career with an access course. And that access course was at Yeovil College in Somerset. And then after that, he went in 1990 to do a degree at Plymouth University. Then he went to Lancaster, and it's only when I was reading this that I realized that actually we were at Lancaster at the same time. He arrived a little bit before my second incarnation at Lancaster, but certainly when he was doing his PhD from 1995 onwards, that's when I was there too. So he did a PhD there, funded by ESRC, under the socio-legal pathway that I think was part of the DTC they had there. After that, he then went to Southampton and stayed there until he came to Keele. So he went there in 2000, and then he was promoted to Reader in 2005, straight from his lectureship, so he didn't go through the SL bit, and then he was promoted to professor in 2009. Now, I've just asked Derek if he's done an inaugural before, and he didn't, and that sort of emphasises something I say quite often in these lectures, that I think it's a real accolade for Keele that we've kept inaugural lectures going as a special part of our annual calendar, because a number of universities have indeed let them slip away. So it reinforces my argument, if nothing else. He was head of social sciences at Southampton for just under 4 years, as I say, before coming here to Keele in 2018. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. And one of the roles that he's taken over, which again is an important role, I think, for us at Keele, is trustee of the Sociological Review Foundation. And that's linked to the Sociological Review, which is the oldest sociology journal in the UK. So even without me talking about the specifics of Derek's subjects and interest, you can see that he's had a long history in sociology, has a broad expertise and indeed a broad knowledge and interpretation of sociology, and I'm sure we will hear that coming through this evening when he delivers his inaugural lecture, The Sociological Imagination and Its Relevance Today. Derek.
I'll need to start with a drink because I've got a tree pollen issue going on and I might be coughing, so let's hope I don't. So, the sociological imagination and its relevance today. The book, The Sociological Imagination, was written by the North American sociologist C.Wright Mills in 1959, just a few years before his untimely death. This book was one of the first sociology books I actually read as an undergraduate, and it's had a profound influence on how I do sociology, how I do my research. The reason I picked it up is it had imagination on the cover, in the title. And I thought, well, nobody talks about imagination. Sociology at that time, and probably still is trying to be seen as a science, as a social science. Why is this guy talking about imagination? So for C.Wright Mills, he opened the door for what I consider to be imaginative ways of thinking and understanding the social world. He talked about things like intellectual craftsmanship. He talked about bringing aspects of the humanities into the social sciences and see what happens. He was into a more playful approach to sociology. He actually referred to sociologists, to quality journalists, to political scientists, to historians, to anthropologists as cultural craftsmen and cultural workmen and cultural workwomen. And this really, really appealed to me. He doesn't really talk about sociology much. What he talks about is the sociological. And that's slightly different to sociology. As well as referring to the sociological imagination as a quality of mind and as a much needed common denominator for understanding our societies and our culture. He combines this playfulness, this quality of mind, with an absolutely fierce drive to make sense of the world. And some of his disciples actually would actually say that he was the one who opened the door to actually them changing or trying to change the world in a small way. So a fierce drive to change the world was combined with this more qualitative, more playful aspect of the sociological. C.Wright Mills also provided a very useful framework, which has been a framework which I've used throughout my research. So no social study that doesn't come back to the problems of biography, our individual experiences and individual biography, and of history, and their interactions with the society has completed its intellectual journey. This might actually resonate with all sorts of disciplines and all sorts of people who are here tonight. This is not just about sociology. This can be about many different disciplines. And this framework of our individual biographies, unfolding in a society, unfolding in a sequential historical context, has been very important to the way I do sociology. My research focuses on migration, on citizenship, belonging, identity, and difference. I know what it feels like to be different. As some of you may know, I actually grew up in the Republic of South Africa during the apartheid years. We were there between 1975 and 1985. South Africa at that time, and probably still is, but definitely at that time during apartheid, was a hyper-masculinist, the most heteronormative culture you could imagine to live in. There was no space for alternative masculinities. There was no space for gentle, kind of effeminate teenagers and boys, as I was in many respects. Homosexuality was classified as a mental illness. There was absolutely no way you could go to the prom and come out at 14 at high school there. That would have probably resulted in a social services, police, mental health intervention. Just one memory about being different, and what it feels to be different. I was at a school assembly when I was a high school student. And we always had these random guest speakers come to speak about all sorts of subjects, and we were all piled into the assembly. And we didn't really know the topic. And the topic that day was on homosexuality by this random faith leader. And his opening lines were, homosexuality is worse than being a murderer. Homosexuality is worse than being a rapist. And I was sitting there thinking, I might be one of these things. I couldn't flinch, I couldn't react, I couldn't draw attention to the fact that I might have been one of these things. And the worst thing was the teachers and the headmaster were nodding at this toxic, rampant homophobia. So I've got some experiences of being different. I have some experience just tying into citizenship and belonging as well, of fluctuations in citizenship. I was a UK citizen until the age of 9. We then immigrated to the Republic of South Africa, where we, as a family, had permanent residence between 75 and 84. Round about 84, my 2 older brothers and I all got letters to say that our permanent residence had been revoked. We had 3 options. We had to voluntarily depart, we had to face deportation with a short stint in prison and leave in chains, or we could naturalize. And if we took out South African, Southampton citizenship, well, if we naturalized, basically, if you were male between 18 and 35, you got your call-up papers to go to the South African military to basic training. The last thing I was going to do is become a South African citizen. I left quite quickly. We voluntarily departed. I've also been an expatriate worker before I went to university. I worked in Saudi Arabia. So I've experienced quite a different types of belonging and of citizenships. So I've also been a migrant, as you know, and an immigrant. I know how it feels not to belong, not to fit in, both in South Africa. Guess what my nickname was in South Africa? Casper. Casper the Friendly Ghost. I was too white for apartheid South Africa. And they didn't even get the irony of that. When I returned to Scotland, as an 18, 19-year-old, I worked at Glasgow Dental Hospital. Yes, I was a dental technician. I can make false teeth, orthodontics, and I can do some crowds. So I might just open a sideline, and maybe in the Moser building, if anyone needs a new set of false teeth, I'm your man. I can also do that. But when I returned from the Republic of South Africa, we're going to have to do some editing, chaps, on this. I actually represented white South Africa for some of my workmates in Glasgow Dental Hospital, who were rabidly anti-apartheid, and rightly so. But I did not represent white South Africa at all. But for them, I did. Eventually, I talked them around. So I know a little bit about migration, citizenship, belonging, and identity, and this is what shaped my research. So my research has taken on these 4 different forms, as I suppose we could call them areas of research, programs of work, and I'm just going to go through them bit by bit. So for my doctoral research, I focused on sexuality, equality, and a bit of asylum as well. And this research was before homosexuality, sexual orientation was a recognized protected characteristic. Back in the day, where we had the armed forces exclusion policy, where we had the unequal age of consent, where we had LGBT asylum seekers, and my case study of gay asylum seekers were unrecognized as being a persecuted social group, of reading transcriptions from trials where judges were saying, you don't really look gay, you don't really sound gay, why don't you just go back to Iran and just don't have relationships? Don't have a family life. Don't have sex again. Maybe they won't decapitate you. That's what they're actually saying. Maybe they won't put you in prison. Maybe they won't chop off your head that they've done to your boyfriend and to your very close friend. And by the way, what's the evidence that you are gay? And the guy saying, well, I was in Iran. If you don't leave a trail of evidence in Iran that you're gay, that leads to prison. That leads to all sorts of problems for you. I've also done some recent work in the last 5 years on the UK voluntary return program, which is actually coordinated by an asylum NGO, Refugee Action, and just examining the tensions between their work as a pro-asylum group and actually helping to send irregular migrants and refugees and asylum seekers home. And the current research, I suppose, is going to source. We're going to Lebanon in May. A group of us from Kiel and also from a few other universities are going out to visit the refugee camps, and Syrian refugee camps in Lebanon. And there's various projects that we've been working on since I've arrived at Kiel with a great team of people. So, the other bit hasn't arrived. So in the early mid part of my career, I wrote this trilogy, which resulted in my readership and my chair at Southampton, really focusing on identity, difference, citizenship, integration, security. The first book, Intolerance Britain, was really focusing on the post-Stephen Lawrence policing culture, looking at racially motivated offences, looking at the introduction of hate crime in this country. The intolerance of intolerance was the big policy agenda there. But looking at how the murder of Stephen Lawrence had a massive impact, not just on ethnic minority groups, but also on sexual minority groups. So this book was all about this wave of the post-Stephen Lawrence wave of policy and practice in terms of reaching hard to reach groups, or groups are hard for police to engage with on a positive level. I also then started to focus on really the post-9/11 aftermath and also the aftermath of the 7/7 bombings in London on all sorts of sectors. The state level retreat from multiculturalism, the local level, we've never retreated from multiculturalism, we just can't afford to. But really the politicians' saber-rattling discourse on this, the politicization of Britishness, which is still going on to this day in terms of the promotion of British values in our schools. The prevent agenda is also something I've looked at. And then looking at securitization and the tensions between protecting human rights. The same government, the Labour government, was thinking of introducing a bill of human rights, a bill of rights in this country, just as they were retreating from rights and treating people in all sorts of negative ways. For the last 9 or 10 years, sorry, that took a lot of clicking to get all that out there, I've been focusing on European migration and settlement to the UK, mostly focusing on the UK's most recent largest non-British born minority group, the Polish nationals in the UK. So there's been many different projects, most of them funded through the Economic and Social Research Council Centre for Population Change, which is based at Southampton, but other pots of money we've brought in to do a whole range of different projects, examining Polish migrants' access to the housing markets in Scotland and in Southampton, their negotiation of the education system all over the country, including rural areas, their social networks, their social capital, and also recently there was a paper came out and an article in The Conversation last week on their attitudes to the NHS, which they're quite sniffy about, I must admit. I've also looked at big historical recent events. So the Scottish independence referendum, which, as you know, EU migrants were fully enfranchised in that referendum. So we did a lot of qualitative research on that. 3 months before the UK's EU referendum, we had a large online survey which seemed to open up a portal for EU migrants to really express their concerns, their fears about impending Brexit. And also whether the big question was, are you going to stay and are you going to go? What are your plans for civic integration in terms of residency, naturalising as British citizens? Can you afford to do it? All sorts of questions. There's loads of papers out there. And we're just about to start a 2-year project through the ESRC on the health and well-being and life satisfaction of EU migrants, which I'm looking forward to be working with some members of this research team on. As well as that, and as well as being a very busy head of school at the time, not quite busy as Dean for Research, I have worked on Chinese-related research. So both of these are quite recent books. They're going to be part of the research excellence exercise, the REF. So I've worked with my colleague, sorry, he hasn't yet, Dr. Shouing Zhang from the Shanghai University of Politics and Law. He turned up as a PhD student and now we're collaborators. We've written these 2 books. The first one focuses on social and ethnic policies in China, looking at examining the Uyghur minority, which are a Muslim minority in China, and how they're treated. There's huge parallels with my earlier work on Intolerance Britain and also the end of multiculturalism here. I think the most fascinating book is probably the anti-corruption book, looking at just how far-reaching the anti-corruption campaign has been for Chinese civil servants. And we interviewed civil servants up and down the country on that low level, mid-level, and a few high levels. And our recent research is looking at governance through community in China. There's some active aging in there. There's some rural policy alleviation and a few other projects that we're engaging with at the moment. And I will be a visiting professor at the Shanghai University of Politics and Law in August or September. I may not have told my husband that yet. So that's news. So, and I think inaugural lectures should be about looking backwards and looking forwards. I've done a bit of looking backwards. And I didn't really know what to do for this lecture, because I do a lot of different things. I was tempting of doing something on Brexit, but I thought, well, this is the week it was all supposed to be over. People would be so sick of it, so I didn't do that. I was going to do all sorts of other things. So I just decided to do what the hell I wanted to do. It's my lecture. If you don't like it, that's just tough. So this is what's going to be happening. We're going back to the relevance of the sociological imagination. So C.Wright Mills, very challenging, controversial figure, I should say. He wasn't cuddly at all. He states what values are cherished yet threatened, and what values are cherished and supported by the characterizing trends of the period. Remember, he was writing in the late 1950s. So I had to think, well, what are the characterizing trends of our period, and what value frameworks are actually being promoted? Sorry, multiple clicks, this one. So this isn't all that cheery. We've got the North American approach to international relations. Let's build a wall. What's next? It's very medieval. Are we going to be building moats? Do we need drawbridges? A bit of burning oil? What is next? We've got austerity Britain. And while the B word, Brexit, which I don't really want to talk about a lot, when you're a Brexit researcher, you're even more sick of Brexit than you probably are. So we've got Brexit. This, if we think of how this has come about, there's a huge disconnection in our country. This is about separation. This is about division. This is about divorce. We've also got austerity. Now, austerity, to me, is associated with hostile environments. It's associated with social indifference. It's associated with social distance as well. We have the cuts to legal aid. The most vulnerable and disadvantaged members of our society are left hung out to dry in courts. We've got the hostile environments, the abysmal, disgusting, shameful way that we treat asylum seekers in this country. I can say that because I've been a trustee of a number of asylum supporting organizations in Southampton. It is hostile, it's contradictory, it doesn't add up. People who should be treated with dignity, we're treating as suspects. We're treating them terribly. But as we know, this hostile environment for asylum seekers has become a hostile environment for any migrant in this country. There's a proliferation of hostile environments. Universal credit is just one example. So C.Wright Mills poses some challenges for us. How can we challenge the hostile and indifferent ways of thinking and behaving associated with the characterizing trends of our time? And how do we transform the indifference of publics into the involvement with public issues? How do we place a spotlight on issues? How do we get attention on the private, personal troubles some of our most disadvantaged groups are experiencing to make them a public issue, an issue of public policy? And if we've got time, what roles can universities play in this? To me, the promise of the sociological imagination is it disrupts the production of social indifference. And for C.Wright Mills, he says perhaps the most fruitful distinction with which the sociological works is between the personal troubles of the milieu and the public issues of the social structure. What does he mean by personal troubles and public issues? Whoops. Well, for me, Mike Lee's film, I, Daniel Blake, hands up how many people have seen it in the audience. A fair number. If you haven't, see it in the next few days. It's very important. So for I, Daniel Blake, he is a man in his late 50s. He has a massive heart attack. He's signed off work for 6 months by specialists, by hospitals. Daniel enters the world of universal credit, the hostile environment of universal credit, and his personal troubles of being signed off of work. He cannot work. If he worked, he would probably died. The specialists in the hospital knew what they were doing. But in terms of social services, he had to have a few phone calls and be assessed by a completely unqualified person who basically deemed him fit for work. He had to become a job seeker. He had to go through the rigmarole of actually finding work. But to me, this is an example of the sociological imagination at work. It's not a sociology book, it's a sociological imagination in film form, where Daniel's personal trouble, and let's face it, he was a very attractive individual. He wasn't a chaotic member of the community. He wasn't an ethnic minority member of community. He wasn't an asylum seeker. It wasn't anything scary that might scare us. He was an ordinary white English bloke taxpayer. And if what happened to Daniel Blake can happen to people who are a little bit more chaotic, I think that's the power of this film. I thought it was low-hanging fruit for McGhee eventually, but I've rethought it. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. So Daniel's experience, and also the young woman who's also in the film, their experiences are projected for us as public issues, not just private troubles, public issues that we should give a damn about. And this is what the sociological imagination is all about in a nutshell. There's more to it than that, but that's just the way I'm trying to present it in this lecture. The sociological imagination for me is all about making social injuries or social suffering visible. There's a political angle to this. A lot of critics of C.Wright Mills say the problem is it's a sociological project, it's not a political project. I think they should reread the book, including Michael Burroway, one of the largest names in contemporary American sociology. Reread the book. This is a political project as well as a sociological project. But in it, there's a longitudinal perspective on social change. And I think Rebecca Solnit's book, Hope in the Dark, is rather good for taking the C.Wright Mills' sociological imagination a little bit further. Changing the story isn't enough. Okay, we write the book, we write the article. It's not enough. We need to keep on chipping away at it. But it has often been foundational to real changes. Making an injury visible and public is often the first step in remedying it. And political change often follows culture. Remember, C.Wright Mills referred to sociologists and others as cultural workmen. So change follows culture. As what was long tolerated is seen to be intolerable, or what was overlooked becomes obvious, which means that every conflict is in part a battle over the story we tell, or who tells and who is heard. Now, this rather frivolous story going alongside that rather important statement is actually us, my husband and I, and our wedding cake. So Andrew's sister Sharon made that. Yes, that's how she sees us. And actually it's probably quite accurate. But this wedding cake is a symbol of a long struggle, not just a struggle for us to be recognized in front of our family and friends as being completely equal to every single one of you, that we could be married. Before that, we had a civil partnership. But before that, we suffered the unequal age of consent. Before that, we were made to feel that we were less than. Gay as good as you was a very important slogan. You know, in the late 1950s, the Wolfenden Committee met on homosexual offences. Look how long it took. Change takes a long time. Now we are protected. Our sexual orientation is a protected characteristic. There was a Civil Partnership Act. There was the Marriage Act. And even if you're not into those heteronormative things, it was bloody important for us to stand up in front of our friends and family and be married. We need a longitudinal perspective on social change. So how can the sociological imagination help us to counter the characterizing trends of our time? Is there a relationship between the sociological, anthropological, historical, political, whatever imagination? Is there a relationship between imagination and the development of a more connected and compassionate society? So some of the antonyms you can find in any dictionary to compassion, and I want to talk about compassion quite a lot, compassion and imagination in this lecture. Some of the antonyms to compassion in terms of ruthlessness, hard-heartedness, cruelty, coldness, indifference, insensitivity. They make compassion attractive, at least in contrast. So I think it's worth us thinking about it. Compassion belongs to a family of altruistic emotions. We have altruism, pity, sympathy, well-wishing, kindness, and the new kid on the block is empathy, which has only been really around since the 20th century. Compassion and related concepts have been the source of 2,000 years of debate and controversy. There's a great deal of linguistic and conceptual slippage. There's a lot of lost in translation stuff as well. For example, when Nietzsche described compassion, he described it as a contagious disease. He was really referring to the condescending qualities of pity. When Horkheimer and Adorno, post-war social theorists, stated that compassion was nothing other than the narcissistic desires of an exploitative bourgeoisie to feel good about itself, perhaps they were more accurately referring to altruism, according to a lot of commentary. Ancient philosophers such as Aristotle and Plato rejected compassion as the basis of moral obligation because it carried the dangers of overwhelming us with emotion, and it was identified at that time with femininity. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, obviously. In a similar vein, Immanuel Kant rejected compassion on the grounds that feelings, unlike reason, have no proportion. And as such, compassion, like other emotions, might lead to an overindulgence in feelings. Arthur Schopenhauer, in his 1840 essay on the basis of morality, took a rather different view. He was steeped in all sorts of Eastern religions as well, including Buddhism. So he took a different view. He argued that morality stems not just from reason, but also from emotions like compassion. Hannah Arendt, who we're going to come back to if we've got time a little bit later, said that there's no place for compassion in politics. She also cautioned about the passion of compassion, which we're going to come back to a little bit later. Arendt referred to compassion as a boundless emotion, which overwhelms people with the desire to vanquish suffering with little regard for the consequences of their action. So she was very concerned about crusading do-gooders syndrome. So we're going to come back to some of this later. So 2,000 years of debates, but here I am going to tackle it. Gulp. So compassion, there's pros and cons. So some of the cons. For Martha Nussbaum, who's probably the most famous contemporary champion of compassion, she's upfront about some of the limitations. She's cautious about compassion because it's unstable, it's malleable. Compassion can be appropriated by both liberal and conservative political agendas. For example, contemporary US, we have compassionate conservatives. They're not compassionate at all, obviously. Compassion is associated with judgment. Our compassion is also often filtered through ourselves. So if someone is suffering, we usually ask, well, could I suffer that? Could that happen to me? Did that person take precautions? Were they responsible? Are they innocent? Are they deserving? Are they undeserving? This stems from Aristotle's definition. So it's very them and us. It's all about identification. It's all about me and my relationship to the world, which is very, very limiting. Compassion can be unpredictable. It can mobilize us. It can immobilize us. We can get compassion fatigue. It might be more about altruism and empathy fatigue. Who knows? There can be a normalization of suffering syndrome, which happens when we feel powerless to make changes, when we're bombarded by images, especially in the media, of suffering. But there can be grand-scale charitable responses. We can be mobilized. Live Aid, Band-Aid, tsunamis, other things, earthquakes. So some of the pros of compassion have actually caught my attention, and I think it's worth us spending some time looking at this. So compassion, according to Bloom, is the cardinal virtue of humanistic models of community and social justice. Compassion is that disposition or way of being that is most fundamentally other-regarding. For Williams, compassion is this vital cognitive force, that is, which directs and impels action, underlying the struggle for social justice. For Bennett, Compassion is all about solidarity. It's all about connecting. Compassion is an active disposition towards fellowship and sharing, towards supportive companionship in distress and woe. So any definition of compassion usually has these three different components. Notice only one of them is about being touchy-feely. There's only one about feelings and emotion. The other part is about seeing, witnessing. It's a cognitive engagement. We then have an emphatic or relationship to the person who's suffering, and it motivates action. Not always taking action, sometimes just the action that is required is being with the other in their suffering. I think the next model is quite useful and accessible. This is more of an organizational take on compassion, coming from the Caring to Change report for the NHS by Western colleagues. So with compassion, there's a cognitive element again. We pay attention to the other. We notice their suffering. We also try to understand and evaluate and appraise what has caused the suffering. We're not getting to feelings and emotions yet, have you noticed? Then there's an emphatic, a felt relation to the other's distress. And lastly, again, there's the helping, there's the action component. But notice it's taking intelligent action, thoughtful and appropriate action. I think they could have done more here. This is about should be about a co-production, a co-creation of solutions that should be the victim or the sufferer centric. It shouldn't just be crusading do-gooders. And I think that's very important for us to get on the table quite quickly. So what I find intriguing about compassion is its relationship with the imagination. There's been a number of theorists and thinkers over time, and I'm going to run through a few of them just to stimulate you to be thinking about compassion yourself. What they're actually saying is the cultivation of compassion is associated with the cultivation of the emotion, of the imagination, sorry. So what is involved in the cultivation of compassionate imaginations? I'm not going to get all very Buddhist on you. I'm not even going to bring any of the Buddhist texts I know of and I'm aware of into this. This is all about Western thinkers, all about Western thinkers. What they're all saying is we need to get past ourselves. Remember when I was talking about compassion filters and egocentrism and how we get in the way of compassion? Well, they're saying we need to actually step back in order to disrupt and extend our usual ways of thinking. And this is rather important for us to get our heads round. So this begs the question, we can't just be optimistic, have you noticed these days? Can we be critically optimistic about the potential for the compassionate imagination for thinking our way into a more inclusive culture? So can we be critically optimistic about this? I'm going to try and persuade you that we should be in these dark times. Let's start with C.Wright Mills. So for C.Wright Mills, the sociological imagination is a practice of being able to think ourselves away from the familiar routines and of our daily lives in order to look at them with fresh and critical eyes. It's sort of taking a step back, being less ourselves. Thinking sociologically is not just thinking from Derek, it's actually thinking from other perspectives. To have a sociological imagination, a person must be able to pull away from the situation and think from an alternative point of view. And we're going to come back to this time and time again. This is about taking multiple perspectives wherever we can. So going back in history, JeanJacques Rousseau, he's not really talking about compassion, but I just thought I'd get it in because he's talking about imagination. So he's talking about, I've cut out that bit. He was actually talking about pity and probably empathy, but he's still in the ballpark, so let's go with it. So it's man's weaknesses that make him sociable. It's man's weaknesses that make him sociable, that connect us to each other. Remember, characterizing trends, disconnection, separation, division. So it makes him sociable. It is our common miseries which turn our hearts to humanity. It follows from this that we are attracted to our fellows less by sentiments of pleasure than by sentiment of their pains. Imagination puts us in the place of the miserable man rather than that of the happy man. So misery, pity, compassion is a connector. It connects us to others. So Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, and for our economics colleagues, this is for you. Adam Smith is the founder of modern economics. He's also a moral philosopher. He talks about cultivating the transcending power of imagination. Though our brother is upon the rack, as long as we ourselves are at ease, our senses will never inform us of what he suffers. They never did and never can carry us beyond our own person. And it is by the imagination only that we can form any conception of what are his sensations. Coming more up to date now, back to Martha Nussbaum in her wonderful, huge book, Upheavals in Thought. Nussbaum talks about compassion, transcending the self, and the expansion of our circle of concern. Expanding our circle of concern is about connecting to others. Some emotions expand the boundaries of the self. Picturing the self as constituted in part by strong attachments to independent things and persons. Love and grief are paradigmatic of such emotions. And as we shall see, compassion pushes the boundary of the self further outward. The rest of that sentence is further outward than some forms of love. Doing so allows for an expansion of our circle of concern. So for Lawrence Bloom, who wrote a tiny little 11-page chapter in this edited collection, this is absolutely the best thing I've ever read on compassion. Compassion is not a simple feeling state, but a complex emotional attitude towards another, characteristically involving imaginative dwelling on the condition of the other person, an act of regard for his good, a view of him as a fellow human being. Bloom says expanding our powers of imagination expands our capacity for imagination. So he talks about imaginative dwelling. What does that mean? You actually stay with, you go and visit someone, you experience the other in intimate ways. Hannah Arendt, who probably would hate it to be lumped in with a lecture talking about compassion, but she is so relevant. She's got a very complex relationship with compassion and with politics, which I haven't had time to go into, but that's what probably the next 3 months is going to be about. To think with an enlarged mentality, thinking beyond ourselves and our narrow concerns, means that one trains one's imagination to go visiting. So you've got imaginative dwelling, you have to go and hang out. You've got going visiting. You're going to the other's house, to the other's world, to the other's life, to try and find out what's going on in their lives through your imagination. Gert Bietza, who's a professor of education, tries to unpack this for us a little bit. So, and he has a pop at empathy here, which will probably result in horrid questions later on. But anyway, to my mind, the main problem with empathy is that it assumes that we can simply, uncomfortably, take the position of the other, thereby denying both the situatedness of one seeing and thinking and that of the other. Visiting or going visiting, as Hannah Arendt describes it, is therefore not to see through the eyes of someone else, but to see with our own eyes from a position that is not our own, as being challenged to understand, to feel, to experience what other people are experiencing through going visiting. And he talks about a decentered way of thinking. So it's just taking ourselves outside of like Derek-centered thinking into a multi-perspectival approach to thinking. I think Martha Nussbaum really helps to try and explain what all this is about. There's a huge connection between what they're all saying. And she's talking about something called the narrative imagination. Any of us who've read a novel or even watched a film, that's what narrative imagination is. We become lost in the characters, lost in their emotions, in their pleasures and in their pains. Martha Nussbaum turns this into a political project. So narrative imagination, as Martha Nussbaum discusses it, is to be an intelligent reader of another person's story, an ability tied to being a democratic and cultivated world citizen who understands the lives of others. Narrative imagination does not only need knowledge and logical reasoning, but also love and compassion. And we're going to come back to this relationship between knowledge and reasoning and technical expertise, and balancing it with the need for love and compassion when we come on to the role of universities today in these challenging times. Back to Hannah Arendt. She takes this a little bit further and talks about the relationship between critical thinking, which we all train our students in, we are all trained in as academics, but bringing in an imaginative, creative way of thinking in order to cultivate the world citizen, the democratic, the open, the respectful citizen. So critical thinking, while still a solitary business, does not cut itself off from all others. To be sure, it still goes on in isolation, but by the force of the imagination, it makes the others present and thus moves in a space that's potentially public, open to all sides. In other words, it adopts the position of Kant's world citizen. When we're talking about the transformative capacity of higher education, should we be talking about the relationship between compassion and the imagination? Martha Nussbaum thinks so. Our campuses educate our citizens. Becoming an educated citizen means learning a lot of facts and mastering the techniques of reasoning. Of course it does. That's what we're here for. But it means something more for Nussbaum. It means how to be a human being capable of love and imagination. We may continue to produce narrow citizens who have difficulty understanding people different from themselves, whose imaginations rarely venture beyond their local setting. It is all too easy for the moral imagination to become narrow in this way. We have the opportunity to do better, according to Nussbaum. I agree with her. And now we're beginning to seize that opportunity. Are we at Keele seizing that opportunity enough? Are we in British higher education seizing that opportunity enough? And note, this is not about political correctness. It's something more. It's something bigger. This is about the cultivation of humanity. For Nussbaum and others, there's a circular relationship between our institutions and the people we produce through them, especially our education institutions. So compassionate individuals construct institutions that embody what they imagine. Institutions, in turn, influence the development of compassion in individuals. Let's bring this right back to Keele. The founder of this university, A.D. Lindsay, said this in a presentation to the Wolverhampton Chamber of Commerce in 1951. I don't think Nussbaum or C.Wright Mills could have written this any better. To me, in this this tiny little passage, this little paragraph, Lindsay sets out a social and political grand challenge. Yes, we have grand challenges, aging, climate change, but actually what he's talking about here is also a grand challenge, a social and political grand challenge. If we're going to try to keep a democratic country and maintain understanding of one another, notice how precarious his language is there. If we're going to try to keep a democratic country and maintain an understanding of one another, it's even more precarious nowadays. We have to send out people from our universities who can do the technical stuff and who at the same time have an understanding of the political and social problems and of the values that lie behind them. This, to me, could be a passage from C.Wright Mills's Sociological Imagination. This leads me, and you'll be pleased to know, I think this is the last slide. Oh, no, it isn't. There's 3 more to go. I changed this morning. Darn it. I was getting all relieved. Guinness was calling me. For Bloom, and I think there's a reason I added this. I just wanted to bring this, the whole action thing and taking action and helping the other in suffering. I just wanted to bring this back in a little bit. Just showing compassion, just giving a damn, can be a transformative social good in itself. So even when nothing can be done by the compassionate person to improve the sufferer's condition, simply being aware that one is an object or recipient of compassion can be an important human good. The compassionate person's expression of concern and shared sorrow can be valuable to the sufferer for its own sake, independently of its instrumental value in improving his condition. Just to stay with Lawrence, just for one more slide. He says there's a transcending moral force associated with the acknowledgement and the acknowledging and attending to the social suffering of others. So because compassion involves a sense of shared humanity, where we're connecting up to other people, it promotes the experience of equality, even when accompanied by an acknowledgement of actual social inequality. We can be with the other in their suffering, even though we're richer than them, more attractive than them, more educated than them, from a different culture. We can still be with them and acknowledge the power imbalance. We can acknowledge the inequality. And this is very, very powerful. This is part of the moral force of compassion. By transcending the recognition of social inequality, it promotes the sensed experience of equality in common humanity. Simply showing up, simply giving a damn, simply acknowledging someone's suffering can be an enormously important and transcending moral force. This is my last slide. Well, apart from the one that says thank you. How can we cultivate compassionate imaginations in higher education? What role can Keele play in this? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the opportunities? Is there a place for imagination and compassion in defining and refreshing Keele's institutional purpose and values? We're refreshing the Lindsay vision as we speak. What can we do? What more can we do? How central is compassion and the imagination in shaping Keele's broader civic role in this region, in the nation, internationally? So in terms of our distinctive research, our distinctive approach to research, our distinctive approach to knowledge transfer, partnership development, impact, and also our educational ethos. On the engagement research side, we're already doing great things. The community legal outreach collaboration Keele CLOC is perhaps the most compassionate things we do in this university. When I read all of the fancy brochures about Keele, I rarely see anything about CLOC. CLOC is actually being with the other in suffering, and through the sort of franchise model across the UK, it all originates at Keele. We are being with the others in their suffering. The people who don't have access to legal aid, our academics and our students, and we've inspired students and academics across the UK to actually help and advise these people who are left with nothing, with no legal representation. We should be shouting about CLOC more. We also have CASIC, which is an amazing organisation and centre here at Keele, which is all about connecting, breaking down barriers, reducing the hierarchies between academics and our user groups and our research groups. Again, this is about connection. This is amazing. And we've got the newest entity, the Keele Institute for Social Inclusion, which I'm deeply privileged to be the first director of. And we are going to be doing even greater work working with these other entities as well going forward. So what role does and can the cultivation of compassionate imaginations play in the curriculum innovation and Keele's development of what we call distinctive graduate attributes? To paraphrase A.D. Lindsay, what types of graduates are we sending out into the world from Keele University? Can we do even more to cultivate the combination of their technical expertise and also their compassionate imaginations? Thank you.